This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 399 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, and I'm sitting here with James Herrholz from Corporate Ladder. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Almost 400, so close.
We're so close to 400. I've got to figure out what we're going to do. It's something special
It's gotta be a
for
good
the
one.
400th episode, and I wish I had a better plan at this point, but something tells me that plan is going to come into shape this weekend because you're here. It's the reason you were here in Colorado for the WeldWorks Invitational, and I will be there too for this weekend. We're actually a sponsor in some way or another, but again, our relationship with WeldWorks goes way back, even pre-WeldWorks. It's a funny thing. Neil Fisher was one of our very first beer judges for Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine.
That's awesome.
Before he launched the brewery all of those years ago. And so anyway, that's a whole nother subject. 400 is coming up next, but this is 399, and the tension is real. Like, we just feel like something special is about to happen. And that special thing is going to happen because James and Corporate Ladder have been making waves out there in this world with Pastry Stout, of all things. Not something that we talk a ton about here on the podcast, but it's been amazing to watch how that whole category over the last 5 years has taken off. And you all have played a significant part in that. You won 2 silver medals at GABF in 2019 and various other categories before the pastry and dessert stout category existed. You would enter those beers in other award categories and won in field beer and chocolate beer. And then, in 2023, when pastry and dessert stout became a category, you all won gold medal for board meeting.
Yep.
And so, I figure, hey, this is a great excuse. In fact, we've been trying to set up this podcast for a while now.
Yeah.
Your brewery is in Palmetto, Florida. I end up back in Florida every year. Somehow our schedules over the last 2 years just haven't really aligned.
But here we are in Denver, Colorado.
Here we are. And we're going to talk about Pastry Stout. I should also mention, I was looking at it this morning, and you guys are, if you take the meteries out of it, the number 1 rated brewery on Untapped in the entire state of Florida.
Yeah, it's crazy. We have been for quite a while, I think since 2019 or so, which is just so funny. But yeah, I think you get to a certain amount of check-ins and your average just never changes, essentially.
Well, but that's 300-something thousand check-ins that you have.
Yeah. And
to still maintain a 4.27 average, it's not nothing. That's significant. I mean, that's the difference, right? That if you can capture people and keep them there,
right,
then that says a lot.
Yeah, for us, it was one metric that we get to look at to kind of see, how we're doing on certain beers. Obviously, it's certainly not the end-all be-all. It is one small, tiny fraction of running a business, but any feedback is good feedback, right?
You can't complain about making people as happy as that seems like it is. And then, of course, you guys have recently opened up a brewery in North Carolina, a production brewery up there, working on a tap room and all of that stuff. And so there is expansion in the midst right now for Corporate Ladder and trying to see where that kind of journey takes you. We are going to talk about Pastry Stout. We're going to talk about regular non-barrel-aged pastry stout. We're going to talk about all the ingredients therein. We're going to talk about base recipes. We're going to talk about how you might adjust those to fit various ingredients. We're going to talk about how you add ingredients. We're going to talk about barrel-aged pastry stout. We are going to get into it on this. We're going to get into the thick of it.
I love it. I see what you did there. Thick with 3 C's, obviously.
Three C's. Before we do that, if you're looking for a brewery chiller that's worry-free and tough on GWP, then look no further. G&D Chiller's Elite 290 Series chiller uses propane as a natural refrigerant with extremely low global warming potential. This natural, highly efficient refrigerant with near zero GWP will help lower your facility's energy costs and impact on the environment. G&D Chillers is committed to a greener, more efficient future. Visit gdchillers.com to learn more. And it's time to stop worrying about diacetyl with Berkeley Yeast's line of fresh strains. These revolutionary yeast strains are engineered to produce the ALDC enzyme inside the cell, preventing diacetyl before it forms. That means no more lengthy diacetyl rests, just clean, crisp beer that's ready for packaging sooner. Whether you're bringing a classic lager with fresh Ondex or a hazy IPA with fresh London, you'll get ultra low diacetyl levels and let your beer's true flavors shine. The team at Fireforge Craft Beer call it a cheat code and a game changer for their hoppy beers. Learn more at berkeleyyeast.com/fresh. Also, a day in the life of a brewer is packed enough as it is, so why not let Old Orchard assist with R&D? Custom blend development is available through their innovative R&D lab. Old Orchard's bulk division supplies a wide range of beverage segments, making it the one-stop shop for flavoring beer and beyond. More information and free samples are waiting at oldorchard.com/brewer. That's oldorchard.com/brewer. You're an Old Orchard fan, right, James?
I actually am. I was just about to say, big fan. We use their juice concentrates a lot. Not that you need another push for that, but if you haven't used them, I would check them out. They are great. If you're not looking for something super thick, because they're juice, obviously, but they're excellent. Flavor's great.
I didn't put you up to it. That was a genuine, recommendation from someone that used it. That's cool. And I've heard that a few other brewers have said the same. Like, heard about it on the podcast. They tried it and especially these days when you got more fruited beer going into lighter and lighter styles and away from some of the big, thick, heavy, sweet, sour, acidic kind of things. That kind of method can be really beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could get into fruited beers, but that's obviously not this topic. We're here to talk about pastry stouts.
That is so Florida. It's so Florida. Oh my gosh. You understand. You live in a place where fruit beers are ubiquitous, and where you really can't make craft beer unless you also sell fruit beer. But let's talk about pastry stouts.
Let's do it.
But first, before we talk about pastry stouts, let's talk about your arc through brewing. What got you into it? How'd you end up, corporate ladder?
Well, I feel like I have the same arc as almost every brewer imaginable.
Are you an engineer?
No, it's a home brewing arc.
Sure.
Yeah, it's one of the two, right?
Okay.
Which one you rolled for your class before you started? But yeah, homebrewed with a friend back in college before I was of legal drinking age, while sharing one of the best old OG stouts in my opinion is it was back then it was 2012 Hunapoo's, which was an amazing beer. I had no idea what it even was at that point in time. I was like, I don't know what this is, but it's amazing. And then
guys would just drink Hunapoo while you were homebrewing.
Yeah. My friend did a documentary for CCB in college, went to film school. That was one of his projects, and as a result, got some Huna out of it, which was awesome. I became a huge CCB fan immediately for various reasons, Huna being one of them, of course. But without I think that beer, as a very side tangent, I don't know that pastry stout in Florida would be what it is. So shout out to Cigar City and Wayne Wambles. But yeah, got it.
And now, yes. I mean, it really is interesting how much you can trace back to that beer, and then Hunapoo Day and the festival and all of that, and just how influential that spread was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously there were other breweries making adjunct stouts, Midwest stouts, but there was just something about the amount of adjuncts, the blend of it, and how seamlessly it worked, and then the barrel aged versions too, and then obviously also Florida, just kind of being that hub for that sweet tea-esque sweet tooth, that seems to run rampant in that state for craft beer. So I'm not complaining about it.
Careful what you say about that state. That is my home state. I was born and raised there.
Yeah,
and most of my family lives there.
I mean, it's a fine state. It's a fine state. Obviously, we have the tap room in Palmetto, and the brewery started there.
Which I find really funny because it is so close to where my wife's mom and stepdad had a little palm farm in Waimama,
right
around the corner from Sun City. It just felt like the middle of nowhere.
I mean, it is. Yeah, it is. There's these little small
then you
towns.
have this brewery that's the highest rated in Florida, like just one exit away or two exits away from where that was, and like that felt like it was the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, it still kind of feels like that. They are doing a lot of development now, so I think that it's Florida, so there's a lot of development in general. There's only so many places you're going to be able to go, so I think Palmetto Parish area will be bigger as time goes on. But yes, especially when we started, It was absolutely in the middle of nowhere. I mean, the brewery was the only thing in that plaza for quite a long time. And it was just a plaza, like a strip mall. Strip mall breweries, also fun tangent. That became a thing.
So your business partner started this brewery,
Yep.
and you got involved in it.
Yep. Yes, back to the roots of Corporate Ladder and how I got involved. So homebrewed, fell in love with beer as you do, and then I ended up actually making my way into any beer job I possibly could. Wound up bartending at Calusa for a while when they first kind of opened up, and then found my way working for Arcane as a cellarman. I was homebrewing the whole time with intentions of opening up my own brewery. We won a bunch of Popular Choice awards doing hazy IPA, fruited Berliners, big pastry stouts, and some lager as well. And then I eventually realized I probably wasn't going to open up that brewery anytime soon. Just was not finding the funding. Had the plans, graphic design was all done. Our name was out there, but it was struggling to get financial backing. And Blake, who was the founder of Corporate Ladder Brewing Company, had just lost his partner and pretty early, and they were only about less than a year old, and they were looking for somebody else, and he needed help with virtually everything. So I was like, I'm your guy. I live in Bradenton, not too far, so I'll come help you out. And then I just hit the ground running, did graphic design. So I did all the label design. I did social media management, took all the photography. I brewed beers, obviously, recipe creation, event coordination. I decided to plan a festival with 24 breweries in 2 months because I'm an idiot, I guess. But it worked. And then we won medals in 2019 shortly after that, which is literally right after I had come on. And the rest is kind of history, just kind of grew it from there and learned as I went about all things business as I was going to already do, but now kind of forced in that role. And he offered me ownership in the company shortly after that. So here we are.
That's cool. So you jump into Corporate Ladder with a year under Corporate Ladder's belt. Obviously, a year is not a lot of time to build a lot of expectations amongst consumers. It wasn't like, you come in and be like, well, why aren't you making the red ale anymore? You're still in this early phase of people, connecting with the brand, connecting with the place, trying to understand what it's about. What were some of your immediate moves to kind of imprint and change the trajectory of the direction that Corporate Ladder was going? Obviously, you probably, if it was going great, you probably wouldn't have had, a breakup at that point. And so you can assume that there was some challenges in that early business. But, every small business has challenges early on. And so,
absolutely.
So what were some of the, how did you start envisioning what the brand for Corporate Ladder could be in the future, and how did you start moving it in that direction with the beers that you were making?
Yeah, so it was creative differences between Blake and the previous partner. She wanted to make more classical styles. He wanted to make more modern styles, and that just kind of did not jive very well in that first year. So when I came on board, Blake and I kind of shared a stronger vision of what we wanted to create in terms of product. And he kind of just let me, run with it. So I created a couple of brands that really resonated with people and stuff that, truly is what I really loved around horror movies. Was kind of one of the big first event I remember, kind of like it catching fire early on. We did Long Live the Horror during Halloween, and it was all horror based stuff, kind of all 80s horror movie stuff. And I made a bunch of beers around horror movies with the horror movie homages, and people loved it. They loved the beer. They loved what it was. And, from then on, it was like, all right, cool. Like I just get to kind of create what I feel like doing. And that was reasonably just, paying attention to market trends, being on top of new techniques, especially then it was hazy IPA, of course. But fruited beers were massive, and kind of, especially in that area, coming from Arcane too, and doing a lot of them homebrewing, I kind of was like, all right, this is really important, and I think we can be. There's nothing like that in the area immediately, especially even going all the way down to Calusa was not doing them. Back down in Sarasota, Bradenton Motorworks and those kind of things, they were not doing them. So literally, it was just kind of up all the way to Largo in that Tampa area, and it was still kind of fairly new.
You had the pastry market all to yourself.
Yeah, right. And of course, what comes along with that was pastry stouts as well, big stouts.
Sure.
And so I wanted to start a barrel program. That was one of the first things I wanted to do. We basically immediately started brewing base beer for for adjuncting, not for barrels, and then kind of parlay that into the barrel aged versions of those beers with slight tweaks, of course, for barrels, which we can get into. But those are kind of the immediate plans of just like...
It still sounds crazy risky to me.
Yeah.
Like, because here you are in a brewery that's in a pretty, I mean, like you're surrounded by farms and retirement communities.
Yeah.
Like it's not exactly, hype beer central. It's
Not
like this is an urban market with a sophisticated, or even a large young clientele that might, be oriented towards the things that are like super cool and cutting edge in the world of beer. I mean, you're in a strip mall in Palmetto, Florida.
Yeah.
Like, becoming a pastry stout factory. I mean, there's a risk to that.
There absolutely is. We could have easily just rested on our laurels and made lager and classic styles like the original partner wanted to do, and probably would have been just fine servicing that area. But, if you're a brewer and you're not making things that you really want to make or things that you want to experiment with and learn more about, then, what are you brewing for? Especially on a small system. That's kind of the whole point. So
you view these as a way to challenge yourself.
Of course. Yeah. Especially because the end goal of those was how I ended up tackling them.
That's a different take than a lot of brewers might say, where I'm forced to brew this kind of thing.
Which sucks.
Because the market I have to satisfy a market. You were legitimately intrigued by how you could make really good versions of this and put the brewery on the map by doing that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I was given the opportunity to do that, which not many people are, just like you said. And I'm forever grateful for that, because we wouldn't be where we're at, and I wouldn't be where I'm at just if that didn't happen. So, but I took a culinary approach to those beers because it was something that was known and something that was easily, you can easily look at it and understand what it is you're supposed to be tasting. And so my goal was to take any beer that I was going to say, for example, we're going to make cherry pie, not a pastry stout, but a fruited beer. We're going to make cherry pie. My goal is to make it taste exactly like cherry pie. That's all I wanted to do. How best to do that? Using real ingredients. And so, I'm on the hunt for what's the best cherry. Like, obviously you have the cherry that goes into cherry pie. You would think logically that's the kind of cherry you would want to use. Well, that ended up being incorrect. We wanted to use Montmorency cherry because it actually had more of a cinnamon-like quality to it, which helped give this kind of crust-like flavor. We also used real cinnamon and vanilla beans to kind of round that out. And that, that is kind of just the building blocks for what that ends up being. Not even talking about the base beer. This is just the end result of what you're treating it with. So pastry stout's the exact same way. So sometimes it's not exactly 100% rooted in culinary. It's like, oh, I love coconut and vanilla and chocolate and all the things you see. But also that's a mountain spar, perhaps, so how do we make this taste like a mountain spar, or what are we going for?
It's culinary science and a little bit of molecular gastronomy added onto it to build the idea and the impression of some of these things and find the character. But it's the same way that brewers are looking at compounds, aroma, and flavor compounds in hops, thinking about the way that these things interact with each other, because the sum can be greater, or the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts.
Right.
If you take a strategic approach, and it sounds like you're talking about. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit more about how you formulate and how you start building recipes and ideas. We were starting to get a little ahead of ourselves right there.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about how you go about doing that, from square one, what that creative process looks like, because you are also, as you say, the, creative director, trying to envision this entire process, not just the brewing, but also the way that these things are, put out there in the world, from the idea through the brewing and then through how they're sold and marketed. I want to talk about that, but first, Oregon-based Indie Hops is expanding possibilities for brewers in 2025. Strata Indie's original hop release is now available in cold-side flowable hop oil form, Strata Hyper Boost, in coordination with Yakima Chief Hops. Indie Hops T90 pellets establish the multi-layered Strata experience, while cryogenic CGX pellets, in coordination with Crosby Hops, and now Strata Hyper Boost with YCH, expand the possibilities. Learn more about Strata and Indie's more recent hop releases at www.indiehops.com. Indie Hops, life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And upgrade your fermentation game with Unitank 2.0. from SS Brewtech, featuring a laser welded cooling jacket for efficient and precise temperature control, an innovative silicone racking arm, and a carbonation stone that allows you to carbonate right in the fermenter. Unitank 2.0 is engineered to help you get the most out of your fermentations, available from 7 gallons up to 1 barrel sizes. Unitank 2.0 will be right at home in your homebrew setup or producing pilot batches at your commercial brewery. Visit ssbrewtech.com to learn more. All right, James, let's start at square one. Pastry stout. The task is assigned. How do you start thinking about a recipe? Now, obviously, you've been able to hone a recipe for years now. You've won GABF medals for your recipes. But when you start thinking about what a base recipe is going to be for this beer, do you start thinking about the adjuncts first and then build the base recipe to complement that? Do you have a go-to base recipe that is going to deliver on some of those components? Do you start from what you want it to taste like? Do you start from ingredients that you just love and then follow the process through? What's that creative process look like for you?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a couple ways that we initially thought about it. I think when we first started doing it, we were kind of just like trying out a bunch of different recipe bases and kind of seeing what characters they lended and what adjuncts would work well with them. We always kind of let the base beer speak to us, specifically with barrel-aged stuff. But we ended up kind of landing on kind of 3 different base recipes, which kind of tweak here and there depending on what we're trying to achieve. So in some ways, we are thinking about the end product, utilizing the changes in that base recipe. Usually it is just malt-derived changes in terms of roast, caramel, base malt, and flaked just for body. Things like that. But really, I think it's this, like you said earlier, it's the sum of all the parts. So it's the finishing gravity. If we're talking about barrels, it's how long it was spent in barrels. It's the adjuncts that you're going to balance it with, whether you're adding adjuncts that are also like sweet, or perceivably sweet, or they're roasty. It's the sum of all the parts. But as a base recipe, the one we kind of go to the most is somewhere around 60-ish % base. Usually it's 15 to 20%.
That's just standard
flaked.
2-row.
Yeah. We've done Golden Promise, Maris Otter. We've kind of done a variety. We landed on 2-row as a base because mostly it's just given us that base sugar.
Because Maris Otter is pretty expensive.
Turns out.
When you're brewing a stout, that kind of gravity.
Yep.
And a lot of that's going to get covered up by some of those other flavors.
You guessed it. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I love Maris Otter.
100%.
Yeah. Would use it all the time if I could. I mean, we use it in our barley wine.
It's great to make barley wine from when that's most of your malt. Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, doing it in a stout just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we found that out pretty early. Standard 2-row, whatever your favorite 2-row is, whatever you love,
Sure.
whatever gets you your gravity, whatever is efficient for you, and whatever your favorite provider is. And then flaked, or you could go malted oats, flaked barley, flaked oats, whatever you want to do, whatever tickles your fancy. I feel like they are all very similar. I really like malted oats because they help lauter really well. Those big old husks, especially from RAR. They're really, really long husks. So really enjoy those. And then sea malts and roast are so different across the board, but percentage wise, they're somewhere between kind of 8 to 12 on either. But each recipe depends on which it is. So if you're going for something that's more sea malt forward, obviously your sea malts are going to be higher, roast forward. But we're using anywhere between 15 and 18 total different malts within those mash bills. We've experimented with different kinds of mashes.
15 to 18 different malts in a typical mash bill.
Yeah. So it's a lot of different kinds of roasts, different sea malts as well.
Those are homebrewer recipes, James.
Yeah, I know. we've dialed some of these back in.
I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that is not exactly the way that commercial brewer is going to brew with full bags in order to achieve the kind of efficiency and simplicity that a commercial brewer would typically want out of that recipe.
It is a little different coming from 5-barrel system to a 20-barrel system. It's much easier to pinch a bag here, pinch a bag here when it comes to 5-barrel batches versus, all right, this is a 20-barrel batch where we're probably just throwing whole bags in here, which then changes your overall roast percentage. You're looking at SRMs, you're looking at roast percentage total, and then it's like, all right, now you're really choosy with what full bags you're putting in. But yeah, what
full bag of roast malt would go into a stout like this? I imagine you're looking for something that's, a little less bitter and astringent.
Yeah, actually, it's just 100% roasted barley.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Chocolate malt, pale chocolate. Those are pretty big staples. Chocolate rye occasionally, chocolate wheat occasionally, chocolate spelt when they were making it. They're not making it anymore, as far as I know. Just kind of a smattering of different roasts. I implore you to explore the different roast varieties that you can do with that percentage total in mind for what the roast that you want to achieve. For me personally, I think pastry stouts need a little bit of roast. We're not talking about Russian Imperial Stout roast levels. We're something to give it a backbone, to give it something that you can base on.
It needs some of that support for the
it absolutely
sweetness that
does.
you're talking about.
Yep. Yeah. We've done batches really early on where we were doing all the roast in the sparge and just to give it color basically, and just kind of have a big malt bomb, and it just does not work. No matter what you do, you need to balance, and that's the key. Really, it sounds counterintuitive almost when you're talking about something that is inherently out of balance. A big pastry stout. But you need
I say it all the
balance.
time to folks. Like, this can be as sweet as you want it to be, and as long as it has enough bitterness to balance that giant sweetness, it's going to be okay. It can have that gravity, and all of that sweetness as long as it's got enough of that. And what we're talking about is roast balance and not hop bitterness balance, because hop bitterness balance does not balance in that same kind of way. That 100%. Roast balance that captures that kind of chocolate character is exactly what you want, to pitch against that. How do your percentages give you in general the kind of perceived bitterness that you're looking for out of those?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we obviously add hops as well. For barrel aged stuff, we're pushing, 30 IBUs, which is still not a whole lot. Some people push IBUs for barrel aged stuff up to 50, 60 easy. We found that does not matter to us at all. But yeah, for our base stouts, we're typically under 20 IBUs. Again, nothing crazy. But we're doing extremely long boils.
How do you think about that bitterness, delivered by some of those roast malts? Do you attribute a certain value? Or are you doing some mental calculations about this? Because, if you're hitting those percentage, but certainly some malts within that are not going to give the same kind of bitterness
100%.
that other malts do.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at two things, of course, sensory and SRM. Those are the big ones. Obviously, we're trying to keep the overall SRM for the total beer at least 75 or above. So obviously fairly dark, but that is, so however you end up building your recipes in terms of total SRMs for your roast, but that is going to change slightly based on long boil times, of course, but just in terms of the roast calculations, you're looking at percentage, sensory, and SRM. You don't want to have, say, for example, if you have a base recipe and you're looking at your 10% of it is roast, obviously you don't want it to be 5% of that to be 800 SRM roasted malt, whatever that ends up being, whatever you choose.
Sure. Or 800 level bond, right?
Right, or level bond, yes. So for us, it's very important to be cognizant of that, and that ends up, like I said kind of before, we end up kind of leaning in towards more pale chocolate. Chocolate's also pretty high, but usually we're staying away from stuff like black malt, black patent, roasted malt, roasted barley, things like that. We're tending to shy away a little bit.
Sure.
We've used it.
We've dehusked. So hot right now.
Yeah, Carafa Special 3 for sure. Great. It's excellent. But it only goes so far, the depth of that. So I think adding several layers is what you want to do.
The depth of that. What do you mean by that?
I think just the depth of a dehusk like Carafa Special, any 1, 2, or 3. I think the depth of that roast can only go so far. You do want inherently some of that, of that husked roast. I do think that slight astringency or whatever that may be perceivably for you. I think that helps lend some more of those coffee notes, dark chocolate, bitter chocolate. I think that is kind of semi-lost in Carafa if you only were to use that, for example, or worse, if you were to not add it to the mash, if you were to add it to the sparge.
What do you use in very small percentages to get up to a 15 different malt kind of grist bill?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm laughing when I say that, but the thought of it is that is absurd.
Sure.
Like, from a commercial perspective, you have to admit that there's some absurdity to that.
Yeah, most definitely. We're using a smattering of sea malts, so we'll use everything down to C20. all the way up to C120. We'll use
generally in even percentages across them, or
yeah, it's usually lower percentages in the higher range, but it really just depends on what you're going for. If you want some raisin depth, DRC is great, obviously. Or same with 120. I think kind of gives a little bit of that more kind of like dark fruit prune raisiny character. But if you're just trying to give kind of that somewhat sweetened back malt thing, like that from those lower C malts, they'll do great. But what I will say is, moving into the 20 barrel system, we've definitely brought that 15 down. So.
So you mentioned you have basically 3 different core recipes, and then where would the other recipes, kind of pull away from, say this kind of core standard recipe?
Sure, they can be much heavier in roast, much higher in or much less in roast overall, much higher in 2-row, for example, just much bigger finishing gravity, or both. So it ends up being, we usually always come back to the one I was speaking of before, where 60 and then 20, and then anywhere between 8 and 12 for both the roast and the sea malts. But we've had some great success in barrel aged stuff that is like pretty simplistic and not what you think, but is very high in like 65-70% in base malt, and then mostly roast with like just a smidge of sea malt, and that's like 5-6 grains, obviously.
Mostly just sugar and bitterness.
Exactly.
And then
and
picking up other kind of depth, sweetness.
The barrel's doing
vanilla, coconut, all of the barrel kind of contributions that those pick up.
The barrel's doing all the work there. Yep.
Yeah.
And but also alternatively, we've had some pretty poor results with that. So it's very interesting to see. I think that, again, it comes back to the sum of all the parts. The barrels matter a lot. Very picky when it comes to the barrels that we get, the people that we work with, and we get the barrels. Nothing's worse than obviously having a barrel you get that you fill and it's very old, leaks, or just completely dry, and you're just not getting any character at all. You just get wood tannins, which is exactly what you don't want. I know a lot of breweries are tempted to dump barrels and taste what's inside. I would highly suggest you do not do that. I think that is a huge reason why these beers taste as great as they are, because they're imparting a lot of the bourbon character, the spirit character, if it's not bourbon, for example, into that product, along with the tannins, of course. But we typically we like really older barrels. When some of the best beers we've had have been also several oak casks as well. I think that also, if the beer can handle it, it needs to be high in finishing gravity to be able to do that. I think that's a massive part of it. Obviously, blending plays a huge role too. So the main variants that we end up changing, getting into barrel aging stuff, is mostly finishing gravity. That is the biggest difference. Obviously, the malt percentages change as well, but our finishing gravity in different stocks of barrels allows us to blend so much, because we can get kind of the best of both worlds. In a low finishing gravity, not as much sugar, you're going to be able to penetrate that wood a lot more, just because it's not as dense, of course. You get more wood tannins, and sometimes more spirit character. Whereas the big sweet guys, high finishing gravity, they are able to withstand a longer aging time or multiple casks and kind of get more depth of flavor that way, while also maintaining big body and sweetness, mostly which end up being kind of the back for big balanced pastry stouts.
It's the Revolution strategy right there. And I know we've talked to Marty at Revolution about that, and their process. In fact, there's a article on barrel aging in the new issue of Craft Beer and Brewing that's coming out pretty soon, where Kate gets into that again, and it is interesting to think about the density of that high gravity liquid slowing down the process of extraction there, but also letting that ethanol gradually do its work rather than more quickly doing its work. We seem to have jumped way ahead of this whole process, but I don't want to leave this one before we go at it. What's the difference, say, in terms of the kind of final gravity that you look for a pastry stout that's going to not be barrel aged, that's going to then go into conditioning on ingredients, versus something that you're then going to throw into barrels?
Sure. Yeah, we tend to not like non-barrel aged pastry stouts nearly as high when it comes to finishing gravity. The depth of flavor is not as big. The tannins are not helping to balance it as much. So, and if you're going to adjunct it as well, you have to be very mindful in what you're able to do with that beer with that finishing gravity. So, a lot of brewers will use nuts.com toasted coconut because it's great, but it is laden with dextrose. So it is going to up your final gravity. If you've ever put that toasted coconut into a stout and taken a gravity prior and a gravity after and a pH, you'll be amazed at just how much sugar you're adding to those beers. So that's something to be cognizant about. But again, even when it's not something that is actually laden with sugar, vanilla, for example, which is typically perceived as something that is sweet, although you get various notes of vanilla if you want to get real deep into vanilla. But I do think that helps with something that may not be as literally sweet. And making it more perceivably sweet. So we like to finish to go back to that question to answer it. We like to finish typically around 1060 in gravity.
Standard gravity.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We find that's a really nice sweet spot because it can be sweet enough on its own, or you can adjunct it with something that's roasty, like cacao nibs, coffee, or you can adjunct with something that's a little bit sweeter and not have it over the top be just sickly sweet and be actually fairly enjoyable still.
Sure. Well, let's talk about mash next, and then kind of follow our brewing process in a kind of linear way through this. Before we do that, did you know that Isuzu trucks have been the best-selling low cab forward trucks in America every year since 1986. That's right, for over 38 years, the legendary durability, remarkable performance, and low cost of ownership of Isuzu trucks have made them a favorite for work truck owners. You may have seen their ultimate craft beer truck that debuted at the Craft Brewers Conference in 2019 and has been there every year since. As members of the Brewers Association, they've partnered with breweries, suppliers, and distributors alike to support the craft beer industry. Whether you're looking for a self-distribution solution or one to deliver supplies, there's an Isuzu truck that will fit your needs. Go to IsuzuCV.com to check out their impressive lineup or visit an Isuzu dealer today to find out why now, more than ever, Isuzu trucks are the trucks you trust for the work you do. And tickets for the Craft Beer and Brewing 2025 Brewers Retreat in Asheville and Mills River, North Carolina are on sale now, and only a handful of tickets remain. There's less than 10 tickets left, James. Brew on homebrew systems with some of the most inspiring craft brewers in the U.S., like Vinny and Natalie Chillerzo of Russian River, Evan Price of Green Cheek, Mark Josephson of Scratch, Bob Coons of Highland Park, Chris Johnson of Green Bench, of course, hosts Ken and Brian Grossman of Sierra Nevada, and more. Learn more and secure your tickets at brewersretreat.com. All right, so if we're tracking through on your brewing process here, anything special in the mash here? Single infusion mashes.
Yep.
You're not necessarily trying to, drive high attenuation. Anything to the mash process there?
Yeah, so just simple single infusion. We are targeting a pretty high strike. So we're typically trying to hit our mash temp around 156 to 158. So we're mashing in pretty high. And
gotta leave some of that sweetness out there.
Sure do. And then our pH, we're typically targeting 5.4.
And these are ultimately just going to be USO 5, kind of Chico.
Yep. Yeah. We used London Ale early on as well. Did not love that at all. Also didn't flock it nearly as well. Although USO 5 struggles as well. We luckily have a centrifuge at the new facility now, which makes it much easier. But man, we would max biofine, spin those puppies and try and get as much as we could. And we'd still have so much that just doesn't flock out, which is, unfortunate on a big stout where you're trying to get as much volume as you possibly can. The one thing we do that is maybe slightly different is we do split our mash into, we do two mashes, which is not different, but in those two split mashes, we take all of our C malts and we mash it in with half of our base malt and half of our flaked first. And then we do a very minimal sparge. We're really just looking to get max first wort runnings. We're mostly targeting a actual volume for each mash because we know that we're going to boil for a really long time. We're usually targeting about like 60% of what we would normally target for a full mash into a 20 barrel batch, and then grain out, remash, trying to boil the entire time. Typically, our boils are 8 to 12 hours, which is not insane.
Even on non-barrel aged, just standard pastry stouts.
Some of those get a little bit less. We'll supplement with a little bit of sugar, a little bit of DME,
Right.
Save on that process. But yeah, for the most part, I'd prefer not to do that. If we have the time and the resources to do so, would like to not use DME and sugar, and then do everything in.
And you're in pretty humid places, even North Carolina. I mean, Florida is obviously extraordinarily humid.
For sure.
And that has to impact some of that boil off rate. And North Carolina might be a little bit better, but it's not that much better in that regard. It's not like here at 5,000 feet and very dry all the time,
right.
where, and boiling at a low temperature where all the rules are different.
Right. I almost wish we had that. We had in the palmetto taproom we're fiber electric. So just three electric elements, and then which were honestly hyper efficient when it came to boiling. Boiling rate was over 10%, and we could turn on them individually. So we can crank them as fast as we could. We could be boiling even before we were done with the first lauter, which was awesome. But at the North Carolina facility, we have steam, which is I absolutely love it. Don't have to clean elements, which is great. It's much more efficient, but actually the boil efficiency, the boil percentage is much lower. It's actually like 3.6, which is pretty abysmal when you're literally trying the hardest you can to condense a liquid and get more sugar into it, which I do believe has quite a lot of flavor contribution for Maillard reaction. So I think that direct fire versus steam versus elements are all going to play a different role in how your pastry stout ends up.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so in my opinion, based off of just the two evidences that I currently have of going from electric to steam, I do believe that the direct heat plays a lot more, like much higher direct heat plays a lot more role in Maillard reaction than the steam does. I still like the stouts that we're making in terms of that flavor contribution, but it takes a lot longer. Obviously, the boil off is also much, much lower, but there's just something about that. I mean, I've had a lot of direct fire stouts too. I know for a fact that they're direct fire and they're long boil, and I also kind of agree they're very similar to those electrical elements where they're just a ton of heat, really centralized, located in one space. Just seems to do a lot for the beer. So I would say for barley wine as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Pro direct fire, pro electrical heating element.
Only for those beers.
Give it a little more scorch potentially.
Only for those beers. Otherwise, I would say, please steam.
Sure.
Yeah. Which is much easier to deal with overall.
There again, there's a process and a technology, for everything out there, depending on what your goals are and how you want to make it. So you go through this boil process and you're trying to reduce, and so obviously, you've got the goals that you're trying to get to, the flavor goal, but also, the kind of density gravity goal that you're trying to get to. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So if it's going to be a stout just for not barrels, we're looking typically at a target of 1135, 1140, sometimes slightly lower. It really just depends on what our finishing gravity is going to be. If we're trying to shoot for 1060 or lower, we'll adjust that accordingly. But we're always trying to shoot for 10% for those non-barrel aged beers. For the barrel aged beers, we get a little crazy, and we have gotten a little crazy. We've gone up to 1160. I think 1169 was probably one of the highest ones we've ever done. And that beer ended up being still pretty high in finishing gravity and high in ABV going into barrel. Which it could handle it, which is excellent. But I think you get into trouble when it's highly attenuated, and it's a little bit lower in finishing gravity. So you get this kind of and it spends a long time in barrel. I think that's where you can really get tripped up. You got too many things playing against you for dryness that you now have to balance out somehow with something perceivably sweet or actual sweetness. But yeah, pretty regimented on that in terms of starting gravity and finishing gravity. Just like you said, USO 5, workhorse. It does the same thing every time. Attenuation is the exact same thing.
Temperatures in a normal range.
Yeah, we're fermenting at 68, so nothing crazy. But we used to when we double batched, we would actually we would pitch and prop up USO5, which is hilarious because it's dry yeast. And we would over oxygenate. And then we would not add any simple sugar.
That's not the way this works, James.
I know. Doesn't make any sense. But then the next day we'd come in and we'd do another 5 barrels for a 10 barrel total batch. And then we would add simple sugar to the end of that one. And then we would also oxygenate halfway through of that as well. And those beers would attenuate in record times and taste great, which is awesome. I know when those beers would typically end up being around 14, 15% when their total attenuation is done. And those beers were massive. When we don't want to do that, we will not over oxygenate. We do not prop. We're just oxygenating as normal and adding USO5, which is the easy way out, obviously. But
sure. Anything else that contributes to the yeast health in this process? Because these are still pretty big beers, and there's also still a lot of sugar, left over in these. And so
absolutely,
it can be that kind of alcohol and that kind of density can be a, pretty ragged environment for yeast to live in and do the thing.
Yeah. If you are ever concerned about attenuating your big stouts, I would say, overpitch with confidence.
Overpitch by how much?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at a standard, pitch calculator, looking at just like a lager, a 1060, for example, I would probably 3x that. But we've had success with 2x very easily. But again, I did just do an episode
last week with Matt from River North, and they're brewing extraordinarily high gravity stouts, and I think they were doing like 4 to 6x pitch rates, and same kind of like massive aeration that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think it's the only way to really truly get, especially USO5, to overperform what its like alcohol tolerance is, right? Which they tell you is 12%. We've gotten it much higher and with tasting great. No issues with poor fermentation whatsoever. The one thing I will say that was kind of eye-opening is if you use simple sugar at all during your pitch and you don't over pitch or over oxygenate, that yeast will eat that simple sugar first and then maybe eat a small amount of the malt-based residual sugar left over, but it will under attenuate by like 4 or 5% of what you expect. We were seeing some of those beers when we were doing just one turn of those beers and adding simple sugar at the end to meet gravity. We were seeing 45% attenuation versus 50 plus, like 50, 52, 54, depending on how, like into 55, I think is the highest we've really gotten on USO5 with those big beers. But yeah, 45 when you're expecting a beer to finish already kind of high is rough. You go from a 10% beer to an 8% beer, it's much higher finishing gravity.
Not much sweeter.
You're not happy. So just a word of advice, just a little cautionary tale.
So you do that through pitch rate and through aeration versus, say delaying that sugar addition to later in the fermentation.
Yes, that's another thing that we have done as well. And you can if you're doing 2 turns, it's much easier. Just wait on the second turn. But if you're not, you can just add it directly to your fermenter. We've had success with that too. And you could spin it. We spin using centrifugal pumps, both during and not during fermentation. We can get into that too in terms of spinning beers and adjuncting beers.
Spinning and adjuncting. That sounds fun. Let's talk about that. Anything else on the fermentation piece before we move on to this?
Nope, pretty standard firm. USO5 just a workhorse. So just make sure you're pitching correctly, oxygen correctly.
All right. So you've come out of fermentation on a non-barrel aged, pastry stout, and you're at 14% ABV, pretty high alcohol. And then what is your general kind of gravity space around there?
So into barrel, we like to go a little bit higher. We like to go anywhere from.
We're not talking about barrels yet.
Oh, sorry. So not in barrels. We're trying to hit 1060. Finishing gravity. And we're usually shooting for much lower ABV.
1060, 14.7 Plato.
Yes, sir.
I've got my calculator pulled up here so I can translate this for everybody.
Yeah, all brewers always tell me, they're like, why do you still use gravity? I'm like, I don't know. It's just, I've just used it forever and never transferred over. Like, you don't like even numbers? I'm like, no, I guess not.
If anyone else needs to follow along, there is a clever standard gravity to Plato and Plato to standard gravity calculator on beerandbrewing.com. It's right there for everyone to use.
Perfect.
It's what I'm using right now to
Look at
translate in real time.
Love it.
Beerandbrewing.com.
Love it.
All right, so 14.7. So that's it's a reasonable, pretty sweet beer at that point.
Definitely still sweet for sure. Make no mistake about it. But yeah, we find that's a nice sweet spot in terms of, like I said before, you can still add a little sweetness and not be overly sweet, but you can also add roast to kind of balance that out if you need be. So in the forms of coffee cacao nibs, or whatever else you want to add, that is roasty.
So let's start talking about, adjunct process there.
Sure. Yeah. Probably my favorite part of the process, because you get to, for me personally, I love to cherry pick ingredients specifically to do sensory analysis on very specific types of ingredients, very specific regions of those types of ingredients. Not just overarchingly we just use just this cinnamon, for example. Where did it come from? Why are you using it? Like, what is the effect of what you're trying to do? Same thing with vanilla, coffee, anything that is regional based, right?
Sure.
But the game changer for us was when we started spinning adjuncts on the beer, adjuncts in the beer. We're spinning them to taste. So you're able to pull at will, and when you feel it is balanced to the way you want it to be. I feel like so many times you were left guessing in terms of like, all right, what amounts am I going to be adding? How long is it going to be in there for? Not only that, but is it fully saturated? Do we have any sort of separation with the beer? All things that are all fixed by spinning the beer.
So when you say spinning, you mentioned it's a centrifugal pump, and then do you have an external dosing vessel, or talk to me about that process?
Yeah. So typically, once we know what we're doing for our adjuncts, we're going to sanitize our bags and weigh them down, and then put them in with fishing line, like high grade fishing line. We have specifically custom welded hooks in our brite tanks that we can put everything on, which is very handy. Before, you would kind of just put it on the spray ball or whatever else you could find to have these things hang. We've also pulled it out of Herrholz before and kind of locked it down with tri-clamps, so it kind of stays closer to the front of the brite tank, which works as long as there's no leaks. You have it that's sealed with that tri-clamp and that gasket. But we will add all the adjuncts first, and then we will purge and then run over.
Still old school style, bags into brite tanks.
Yep. We don't have a spin bot, but that is the next iteration. But that has worked well for us. We usually are sending much less liquid and oversized brites, so we can have much more volume of adjuncts, and it works out really well there. But yeah, we've been doing that way for quite a long time. Sans spin bot, But I know a lot of brewers use spin bots, and they are great. We'll get one eventually.
Sure. I've seen numerous iterations over the years, and of course, you've got everything from the old hop cannons that Sierra Nevada used to the spin bot, which
Torpedo.
the spin bot, I believe was a Cigar City invention by
Jay the Welder.
Yeah, Jay the Welder, one of their engineers. And I remember seeing those external dosing tanks at Angry Chair years and years ago. Same kind of thing.
Absolutely.
We've also seen like high density infusions. Pulling off beer, doing a kind of controlled high density infusion. But it's interesting for you to go back to that kind of hanging bags in a tank. That seems like the old school, maybe less efficient way of this kind of extraction. And I know that especially when you start talking about the quantity of ingredients here and the expense of those ingredients, like efficiency matters quite a bit in this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we are kind of we are stuck with what we have.
That's what you got. Yeah.
Yep. And so we kind of just make it work. It's what but it's not necessarily the best way.
Are there any techniques to use knowing that you're hanging bags in there that help improve the extraction, whether that's temperature, whether that's, bubbling CO2, are there any, other, burping tanks? Are there any things that you're using, to try to keep things mixing correctly, to kind of aid that extraction?
We've burped a decent amount of times, but I feel like that doesn't do much. I feel like spinning is the most efficient thing we can do in this iteration with hanging bags.
And so when you're spinning, you're pulling, you've got ports on the top, ports on the bottom. You're kind of moving up and down, up and down, up and down continually.
Yep. Yeah, we have our brites have whirlpool arms, so we just go through there. So they're constantly making a whirlpool. And when we're hanging bags, we're very cognizant of where the level is going to be of those. So it's not hitting the bottom or it's not too high. And they have weights, so they are always submerged. Those are the things that are the most things that we can do. Just making sure that things are in there and free spinning. When a pump power goes out, for example, overnight and it doesn't spin, the difference of if it were to spin overnight versus if it didn't is massive. So we know that spinning does a ton of work.
So you just learned that from the pump that didn't spin that night.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Also, that's just...
When you say massive, what do you mean by massive?
I mean, like you have...
It feels like it didn't do anything.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Which is so funny because you can go from 1 hour, depending on what the adjunct is, where like you have obviously nothing in there, and then you're doing things throughout your brew day, you're doing things in your cellar, and you go back and you taste it 2 or 3 hours later. Oh wow, there's cinnamon now, or there's vanilla now. It is always so fun to kind of see that come through as you're spinning. But yeah, spinning does the most work, I'd say.
Anything to the temperature while you spin there, or in terms of rate, and also like how does obviously managing oxidation through that process is a pretty important thing to do, to make sure that you're not also shredding the beer while you're spinning it.
Absolutely, yeah. We take every precaution when we're working with CO2 within those environments. Like I said, for putting all the adjuncts into tank and then CO2 purging first before running over. But we're actually purging through lines within the pump as well, and then typically running through the pump. So that way everything is in line where you need it to be, and everything's already purged. There's only so much you're going to be able to do in terms of oxygen when you're adding free ingredients, right? Like even if you're purging it out, like you're going to get some oxidation. Although I am a little bit of a proponent that I think oxidation with big beers like that helps in some degree. Micro-oxidation obviously is part of the barrel aging process. So I do think some of those beers do get slightly better. I'm not saying intentionally oxidize your stouts. Do not do that. I'm just saying if there's some oxidation that happens during that process, it's probably okay.
A little bit. Yeah. A little bit is okay.
Just a tiny amount. And we don't have any way to find that out, unfortunately. So we don't have C box or any way to test. So there are probably oxidation in those stouts. Yeah, probably.
Well, let's flip back and talk about selecting ingredients. You mentioned that you try to take a very intentional approach to finding the right origin, but not just the right origin, the right, flavor and aroma expression within some of those origins, evaluating sources for some of these things, and trying to figure out how those match this kind of culinary idea for what that flavor might be, defined by some of these things that we taste and other kind of taste and smell in other aspects of our lives. Talk to me about that kind of creative process and, some of the, maybe some of the challenges that you've experienced in that and some of the, more successful ways you found to, capture some of these kinds of culinary flavors and aromas.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite parts of making these beers is going through and finding different varieties and sources for different ingredients. Sensory is the biggest thing. I think if you're able to get samples, or if you're able to be intentional about that stuff with some trial in some way, something that's controlled, I highly recommend doing so. Real ingredients first is another huge thing. It's extracts do some work, and I'm a believer that if you use good high quality extracts, again, from good sources as a top note on certain things, they can be nice. But a lot of breweries will overdo or rely heavily too much on those. And I feel like it's just, no matter what you do, even if they're real extracts, they just don't have that same depth of flavor. And they do seem somewhat artificial, even if they are naturally flavored. So with that being said, I'll take vanilla as a great example. This not sponsored, but shout out to Ted Jones, an amazing human being, great man. I think most brewers probably get their vanilla beans from him at this point, but if you're not, check him out. He has a wonderful guide of vanilla beans from different varieties. He will tell you all about the farmers from those different regions if you are interested in that background. But I've worked extensively with him on kind of different sensory analysis, talking to him about how vanilla beans are grown in certain regions, and what to expect year over year over those different vanilla beans, because now, just like hops, they're not always going to be exactly the same. There is going to be some differences in your Vanuatu vanilla beans from year to year. But for the most part, we have a pretty good sensory base built up at this point of what we can expect as base flavors from each different varieties, and we use those accordingly. So if we're looking for a really specific baking vanilla, kind of like your typical vanilla, most people I think of Madagascar when they think of that. I actually end up using Uganda more often than not. It is also very cost effective as well. So if you need it in abundance, it's great. But we process all those vanilla.
And what's the difference with? Obviously, it's still hitting that kind of Madagascar baking vanilla spice.
Yeah.
But what does it do differently, and what makes it better? I think more interesting for you, not necessarily better. That's a
sure. Yeah, I think it's just it's totally just subjective, right? Like, one's not necessarily better than the other. But what I think it hits on really well is to me, it kind of gives more of a depth of flavor for classic vanilla, but also gives you top notes of like some dark fruit for the most part. That's mostly what I get out of Uganda. Again, every year is different. Every lot is different. But I've always loved it in, hilariously enough, not pastry stouts, in fruited beer.
Sure.
I've always loved it. But we always process those ingredients as delicately as we can. We're not trying to use heat with those ingredients, or with vanilla specifically, we're just cutting them open to get the caviar, like most people are. A lot of people will talk to me and be like, why don't you just use vanilla extract? You're essentially just doing the same thing. You're literally taking something that's like high in alcohol and you're spinning it with vanilla beans, and you're not wrong. But I've tried it. It just doesn't, like I said, just doesn't seem the same to me. But I think the thing here is to be intentional always. And that's knowing what you're trying to achieve in all forms. So when you're starting out, what you're trying to finish, and it's intentionally selecting your ingredients. And for us, like I said, most of it is sensory based.
Any other interesting things out there in the vanilla world that you found in sampling, doing sensory on either origins or even year-to-year variants and some of these, single origin?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you can easily get burned if you're not paying attention to that year-to-year change, because if you use, for example, I'm trying to think of a recent example. If you were to use a vanilla, for example, that you're so like, it's going to give you like some dark chocolate, some caramel, like marshmallow, you're like, this is going to be the perfect vanilla bean for big pastry stout, right? I'm already going for these kinds of flavors that are already in there. Awesome. But then you don't pay attention. Maybe it's got a slight floral note. You can ruin your entire beer depending on how much vanilla you're using. If you're using it as just a small amount, like you're using as a supplement, but if it's the star of the show, and you didn't really sensory analysis or do anything beyond that, like just kind of trusted that process, and you get a floral pastry stout, that's pretty rough.
You just wasted all the other coconut that you put into that. If you've screwed it up with that floral vanilla note, damn it.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's fun and neat in certain aspects, right?
Sure.
But yeah, when we're talking about pastry stouts, we're really just looking at this little box here.
And so you don't love that floral note, but you are looking, for more of that kind of, spicy kind of cutting note to it.
Yeah. I think having some baking spice from vanilla is nice. But again, it always boils down to what are you trying to achieve, right? But like I said, I think you're kind of in a box with pastry stout. So yeah, you're looking at classic dessert flavors, basically.
Sure. And so you've got all your standard things. You've got your vanilla, you've got your coconut. You mentioned that, you find cherry pie and, these other kinds of components, and are trying to deconstruct those flavors. In terms of pastry stouts, what have been some of the most challenging but also intriguing flavors that you've pursued? And talk to me about some of the ways that you have found to kind of express those flavors in a beer form.
I would say caramel, beyond malt derived caramel, is really difficult, if not impossible. Because when you think about what caramel is, it's just literally sugar. So how are you going to get that flavor into?
And in addition, dulce de leche,
exactly,
creme brulee, and all the other kinds of caramelized sugar, kind of, pieces in that family.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Same thing with anything that's texture related typically. Like most people associate with texture over flavor. So pie crust is difficult, shortbread can be difficult, like things like that. You typically have to rely on other flavors that are typically within there that are like low perceiving flavors to kind of boost those in some way. So that could be vanilla, for example. It could be some baking spices, depending on what you're trying to do. Cinnamon, for example, for pie crust. I know some people use graham crackers, things like that. I think can help you achieve that. I mean, some people will use real pie crusts, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend if you want to have...
That sounds like a very Florida solution to this problem.
Yeah, definitely. We've certainly...
I say that with love. I say it with love.
Always. I mean, we've certainly thrown real baked goods into beers before, but like, it's not a great idea. Sure, you're going to get some flavor out of it, but you're going to have an absolute mess, and you're going to lose a ton of beer.
What was the most challenging, pastry ingredient for you?
Most challenging pastry ingredient specifically. Beyond caramel and like texture stuff. When we used real vanilla wafers was probably one of the worst. The outcome was good, minus the loss, but what ended up being how inefficient that beer was in terms of the loss and what we added to that beer. Like head retention was absolutely awful because we're obviously adding a ton of oil. Like all looking at ingredients like that where you're actually like, how are you processing this? How are you adding it to this beer? Also, is it shelf stable? Like pasteurizing that beer, you're adding sorbate or sulfite to it to make sure you're helping it to be shelf stable. All stuff that you don't really want to mess around with. That was one of those things where it's like, all right, we did this once. Sweet. Let's not do this again.
Never going to do it again.
Let's not do this again.
Was there anything unexpected in this kind of flavor realm? We're like, this has really turned out even better than I thought it might be.
That happens all the time, man. We'll go into a beer. I've named it something, and it's supposed to be inspired by this dessert, and it tastes like once everything is melded together, it tastes completely different. And back in the day when we were not even packaging everything and it was all like some of it was draft exclusive, it was so easy to just, we'll just call it a snickerdoodle or whatever it is, whatever it ended up tasting like, for example. I guess getting back to the challenging aspects, I think early on specifically, it was always about the challenge of balance, in terms of heat, if you're using spice, like actual peppers, or balance of sweetness or perceived sweetness and roast character. I think that was always going to be challenging no matter what. And that was all just dosage ratio, time and spinning, et cetera, et cetera. But unexpected flavors, I think just melding together of different nuts, and like what those oils can do for the mouthfeel of the nuts, freshly roasted nuts, along with, different varieties of cacao nibs can sometimes surprise you. You expect it to be just a chocolate, and you're going to get several different things out of it. Trying to think of recent examples. I can't think of any right now.
That's all right. Do you have a favorite?
A favorite like stout?
Favorite pastry stout that you've made?
It's hilariously probably board meeting. That beer was one of the few beers, usually, like I said, usually we combat it from an angle of this already exists in the culinary aspect, and so how do we make this in liquid form? But board meeting was not that whatsoever. It was a showcase of balancing a big barrel presence with something that's already sweet with kind of an overwhelming amount of depth of vanilla, with coconut. But it was way more vanilla than we ever use on top of a beer that already had. It was just pushing an extreme beer in an extreme way and trying to keep it somewhat balanced, which was the challenging aspect of it. Right.
So how'd you do it?
Well,
how many different vanilla varieties?
There were 3 in that one.
Okay.
Yeah, there were 3 in that one. And we, if I remember correctly, we dosed that beer with, I think it was 2 pounds per barrel vanilla beans. So quite a lot. But
that is an expensive beer.
It was very expensive. I'm glad it won. because it would have been for naught. But it aged in Stag Junior barrels for, I believe it was 24 months, and then into Old Fitzgerald barrels for another 18.
Was it a single stream beer, or was that something where you blended different barrel stock in order to build the finished beer?
That one was specifically one single beer going into single different barrels and then into double barrels.
Wow,
so
okay.
I did not even blend those. They were also specifically, though we took some of that and made another beer off of it versus the board meeting. But yeah, we usually blend. We usually do blend just because we obviously make a lot more barrel aged stout nowadays than we were back then. So
Sure. And if you've got multiple recipes like that, then
yep.
sometimes you can take a little bit here and a little bit there and get what you need out of it.
Right. I mean, 4 years ago, wherever that beer was actually put into barrels, we were not making that much barrel aged stout.
So then 3 different vanilla varieties.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Why? And what's the how do you think about blending vanilla varieties on that?
So you, at least for me, typically I'm looking for some overlap that makes sense, along with nuances from each that I think will coincide together. So those varieties, I cannot remember off the top of my head.
That's all right.
I chose those vanilla beans specifically, and in general, when I choose vanilla beans, like I said, with intention, overlap, looking at those specific flavors that I expect out of those vanilla beans, those varieties. Instead of just using, if it's not a showcase or just a role player, for example, it needs to be things that are going to mesh well with that base beer. So we're tasting that base beer, we're knowing what we're getting out of that. So we're writing sensory down, and then we're looking at our sensory analysis for all our vanillas, and then we're choosing from there. Granted, we're looking at this as we know this beer is going to be awesome. We love how it tastes now, so we're going to spare no expense when it comes to the adjunct portion of it as well, because we already spent a ton of money on the barrels, base beer itself, and the time invested. So might as well make this the best we can.
Any other tricks to barrel aging that you use? I mean, Florida, the environment, it's pretty warm. Like there's, it's pretty warm most of the year. It's not like you're going to get some of the dynamic tension, of Kentucky, of warm and then cold, and this kind of seasonal push-pull that a lot of distillers talk about in terms of pulling beer or whatever the liquid is in that barrel in and out of the wood. It's just hot all the time for the most part. Few exceptions, obviously.
Yeah.
Are there any other techniques that you use in order to, kind of make sure that you're getting great barrel expression in barrel aged stouts?
Yeah. So heat is definitely, I think, a huge factor when it comes to extremely big beers, finishing gravity. I mean, it is going to help push that into the barrel further, as it's not as dense when it's hot. So I do think that is part of the reason why Florida, especially barrel aged programs that are in warehouses outside, have had a lot of success. Not to say that they're, obviously distillers in Kentucky and that region are not incorrect when it comes to the push pull of winter versus all of the different seasonalities. I am very curious to see how these beers are going to be now in North Carolina with that more seasonality as well, because I do feel like we unexpectedly and maybe semi-expectedly had to use that heat probably more to our advantage than we might have thought, which is funny to think about. But in terms of anything else we use technical wise, in terms of barrel aging, again, being intentional with your base beer, being intentional with your barrel picks, and your finishing gravities, and knowing what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. Those are the main things that I can preach for sure. As a lot of other better brewers make tons of much bigger beer and much bigger barrel programs, rather. They have a lot more to think about in terms of their sensory and blending analysis than I do. Just kind of a one man looking at some barrels, in our inventory management system. So
I loved it. A couple of months ago, I did a podcast with Matt Brindleton and Hennick from Omnipolo and Frau Gruber. And, they talked about when they're brewing collabs now, because, they keep all of their barrel cellar, temperature controlled. And that in the collabs, some of their collaborators are specifying different temperatures for aging for that same exact thing we're talking about here. And it's so interesting to think about even like barrel storage temperature as something you might add to your recipe list as a potential ingredient in this whole process. But naturally it does change the kind of arc of aging on these beers. That's really interesting. Well, we've been talking for a while now. We should, probably, tie a bow on this one. If you're thinking about what makes the biggest difference in the pastry and dessert stouts that you make, if you're thinking about giving some guidance to other brewers out there, what do you think are the biggest difference makers for folks?
The biggest difference makers is, having a good base. You cannot out adjunct a bad base. You just can't. You can't do it. You could try. You can certainly try. But you're going to have a much better time, a much more fun time having a good base beer that is going to let those adjuncts shine in the way that you want. And then quality of ingredients and using real ingredients. I think those are the biggest things. Yeah, for sure.
Well, that is a great place to bring this to a close. G&D Chiller's Elite 290 series chiller uses propane as a natural refrigerant with extremely low global warming potential. Unlock the ultra-low diacetyl cheat code with fresh strains from Berkeley yeast. Try Old Orchard's custom blend program to dial in the perfect fruit flavor in your beer. Indie Hop Strata is available in every format you need, from Hyperboost to CGX pellets to classic T90s. SS Brewtech's Unitank 2.0 will help you get the most from your homebrew and pilot batch fermentations. Isuzu trucks are the trucks you trust for the work you do. And get tickets now for the 2025 Craft Beer and Brewing Brewers Retreat at brewersretreat.com. I would normally finish off the episode right now asking you to subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing, but I actually want to change it up a little bit this time around. If you're a regular podcast listener, but you don't subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine or Brewing Industry Guide Magazine, I'd love to know why. I just want to know why. I'm just curious. If you are a podcast listener, but you don't subscribe, drop me a line, podcast@beerandbrewing.com. Let me know what's keeping you from becoming a subscriber. I'm just curious about that. We try to deliver what people want, what brewers, information that brewers can act on. It's going to make their beers better. And, if something we're doing within those print publications and digital publications isn't hitting the mark for you, I'm just curious what it is. So drop me a line, podcast@beerandbrewing.com. James, if people want to learn more about Corporate Ladder, about the award-winning, medal-winning beers that you make, pastry stouts, obviously, because that's been a big thing for you. But, you make a lot of other beers. You make 724 different beers, according to Untappd. In fact, if people learn more about the beers you make, try them, acquire them in some kind of way, where can they find you all?
Yeah, you can find us at our Palmetto Tap Room in Florida. That's where all of our beer is sent currently and made. And then in North Carolina, we have limited distro currently. And then we do some work with Tavor as well. So if you are on Tavor app, you can get limited beers from us through them. And then shortly, later in the year, we'll be doing some work with Halftime Bev as well, very similar to kind of Tavor as well. Those are the best ways you can find us.
Very good. Very good. Well, thanks for talking to us about pastry stouts. It's been fun to pick your brain and enjoy all of the sweet bits that you've shared with us over the course of this episode. Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media @Craft Beer Brew.